And when organizations are working closely together and recognizing each other's strengths, there's some beautiful synergies that emerge that create far more impactful approaches. And what you're naming is like the dream from my perspective. It was like, wow, to have, three, four organizations come and say, hey, we want to do this thing collaboratively. That would have been huge. I love this space where things are complex and you're trying to move them to more clarity, right? And so asset mapping is another tool to move in that direction.
So, Janet, we've talked a lot about the ripple effect and we've talked about evaluation, so on and so forth, and how important that is to funders. But does it have a role to play in getting nonprofits to work together, to do things together that they couldn't do separately?
Collaboration has been a big focus of, well, the whole sector now for years because, when collective impact was really starting to take off in sort of the 2010, 2013, it came on my radar in like 2012. It was that recognition that the nonprofit sector is here to solve complex issues that are not easily solved. And when organizations are working closely together and recognizing each other's strengths, there's some beautiful synergies that emerge that create far more impactful approaches. So, for example, having, identifying what that common agenda is and sharing your data across organizations. Can you imagine sharing your data across organizations, right? But when that happens, then and you become more transparent on what those goals are, then organizations start to sort of self-regulate and fit into where they fit best to achieve those goals. And the communication becomes much stronger. And it all started in those early days in the community that I was in with just, as a funder, fostering organizations to sort of break bread together and get familiar with each other, introduce themselves to each other, learn about which populations they're working with and how they're trying to solve those issues. And as that trust starts to build, then wonderful new collaborative opportunities, arise. And of course, the fruits of that labor all came to bear during the pandemic because these organizations now, they already knew each other, knew what each other's work was, were in relationship with each other. But the urgency of the pandemic created an urgency to mobilize really rapidly such that they could lean into each other's strengths quickly and address, emerging needs very rapidly. And when your funders are involved in that, you can collectively mobilize really rapidly. So it's ended up getting tested at a level that none of us were anticipating.
I am curious from a funding standpoint, because you've been in the funding world, is it more attractive to you as a funder for, let's say, 3 or 4 nonprofits to come together and say, look, we have this thing we want to do together as a collaboration, and we would like to help you. We would like your help in funding it. Is that attractive to a funder? Is that something they go, oh, this is something we could get behind?
Yeah. It definitely was for us. And of course, traditional foundation applications and systems aren't always set up to foster that, right? But I mean, and what you're naming is like the dream from my perspective. It was like, wow, to have, three, four organizations come and say, hey, we want to do this thing collaboratively. That would have been huge. But more often than not, it was a funder having to be a culture creator and having to actually create systems that
To bring them
help
together.
to bring them together. Because inherently, grant application cycles tend to pit nonprofits. They tend to they shape it like a scarcity model rather than an abundance model, right? It's
Right.
encouraging organizations to feel like they're competing against one another. So we would use a lot of different tools to move out of that space. One was essentially we would run special grant cycles that you were required in order to apply. You had to have like 2 partners on it or something. And so that was really unique. And all of a sudden, organizations had incentive to talk to their partners on it. Another thing we were using that came out of the Tamarack Institute was using some, I'm going to pull up this, we would use this in the collaboration spectrum right built into our application. So you would ask an organization, where do you fall on this collaboration spectrum? And you can see, it moves from turf in the lower left corner, to trust in the upper right corner. And so many organizations would say, if you just asked me if we were good collaborators, we would have said, oh yeah, we're all the way on the right of this thing. But when they got into the nuances of what it really meant to collaborate, then they were kind of, oh my gosh, we're like far like away from where our goal is. But just as it is in, whether it's our personal therapy or our collective nonprofit self-awareness or funder self-awareness, having a sense of collective self-understanding of where we fall. So this is a great tool to use with boards, to use with other. And so when a funder starts to give credibility and incentive to do this kind of stuff, the behavior of the sector start to shift. Even if you're not even like funding based on it, we just used it as an educational tool. Just tell us where you are along this spectrum, and all of a sudden you felt that move along. And then over time we would move into to again, really making grants that were sort of multi-year, longer term toward collective impact initiatives specifically, that because you're moving the needle not just for the nonprofits, but also for donors and also your board members. It's a lot of community awareness and education that all needs to come along together. And it's a commitment, but it's exciting when a couple of years in, you start to hear those other stakeholders start to use the language of strong collaboration.
Now, I know we're talking about REM and the ripple effect and all that. How does that fit into the collaboration model? Is that a separate thing for your consulting company, for you, or is that integrated within the REM model?
Yeah, so ripple effects mapping, one of the places it really started to, have teeth was in those collective impact type environments, because you're bringing many stakeholders to the table, and then and communication is a constant challenge, right? These are in spaces of high stress or high needs or high responsiveness to service recipients and service partners. And so convening people in one place and getting them to talk about the positive impacts creates a lot of education and awareness across those organizations as well. So for ripple effects mapping, it's a great opportunity to convene and collectively reflect on the impact of the work, and it reinforces those relationships and it actually builds more trust. I've seen REM work really beautifully in high stress environments too, where there isn't a ton of trust, but the facilitation technique and style that we use often moves people toward greater trust. And at the end of the 2 hours, they're in a very different mental space, as everybody has heard and listened. So it provides some good things. But we also use, for those large coalition type environments, some other mapping styles too, which I'd love to talk a little bit about. Asset mapping is one of those.
Sure. Okay, well,
Yes.
let's go ahead and do it. Yeah,
All right.
because this is such an interesting area, and I think it's probably an area that I would say 99, maybe 95% of the nonprofits really are not aware of.
I think that's true. And it's so fun to talk about this stuff. I mean, any nonprofit I meet with, any funder I meet with, there's always sort of like a deep curiosity and an appetite to learn more. And then when we get into it, oftentimes there's participants in a ripple effects mapping session that one client has taken off, and then they immediately are like, can you do this with this group? Can you do this with this group? Because they can see the value of it immediately. So that's really exciting to be in this space. I had done some ripple effects mapping for a clean energy climate group that was national, and I essentially convened a number of leaders from multiple states that were doing sort of clean energy related work at the local level. And their prompt had to do with, tell a story about a time when you saw local behaviors change as a result of your organization's work, so whether it's recycling or, heat pumps or, a whole host of things. And then we got into like, what made those changes? So just the coolest things emerged from like that, like the difference between a coalition trying to advocate with their elected officials versus youth trying to advocate. All of a sudden, when the youth voices spoke, oh, the elected officials listened, and all of a sudden policies changed. And so you saw some wonderful youth movements related to clean energy, emerge across the country. And it was exciting to see, like, what are the levers that you can pull that actually change, local behavior. So then that got reported out, and a colleague who also does some mapping said, "Hey, it was so exciting to see that you had that you're doing some mapping in the environmental justice space." And so then he and I got talking, and now Mark Kravitz is one of my buddies who we talk mapping all the time, and he really got me more into sort of asset mapping. So asset mapping came out of like the asset-based community development work, ABCD work out of Northwestern University's Institute for Policy Research a while back, and it's continuing to evolve. But again, the availability of those mapping softwares has made this stuff more accessible and really exciting.
So let me
Yeah,
ask you something.
yeah.
Asset management or asset evaluation, ripple effect. Are we talking about just numbers here as far as assets? Are we talking about money, or are we talking about all kinds of assets?
Yeah, great question. So I'm going to show you an example. So
Okay.
again, I've already identified, I love this space where things are complex and you're trying to move them to more clarity, right? And so asset mapping is another tool to move in that direction. So we work in these spaces of coalitions and collaborations that have maybe a lot of reports, or they're operating from a lot of reports that can be very overwhelming. I started working with one coalition, and they started sharing with me like the 100 partners, right? So this lengthy list of all these partners. But which can be overwhelming to the new young leadership pipelines that we're trying to create for as people come into these systems. These systems are complex. So asset mapping can move into different sort of visual spaces. So we converted this list into something that looks more like this, where you've got all of your nonprofits that are partners in this coalition in light blue. You've got all your government partners in dark blue. You've got your school districts in yellow, your higher eds in orange, your funders, your coalitions, just giving you the gist of like how this might be meaningful, right? And then you can code them differently. So this is like these on the top part are your regional partners, but those that have the black dotted line are like statewide. So you can just at a glance look at this map and visually get information and see where representation lies pretty rapidly. And then once you've sort of established who the players are, you can start to look through different lenses. So for example, there's multiple goals of this particular coalition. So we could say, okay, goal number one is this top horizontal area. And then different organizations have different levels of engagement. It's a high engagement, activity. And just to continue to give some additional examples. So then we took so the dark blue ones are the government entities. Well, what the heck does, economic security play in terms of the role of early childhood education? So then we start making maps of oh, here's the governor's cabinet. Here's all the departments underneath the governor's cabinet that are involved with early childhood education. Here's the bureaus and divisions within those, and here's what each one of them does, but creating these rather than lengthy reports that confuse, providing simplified maps that quickly show this is what they do at the state level. Here's another map for the county level. Here's a map for the municipal level. And you can even take that down to school districts, for example. Oh, okay, here's a host of services, the family resource centers that exist within different school districts. Here's the early learning centers, preschool programs, Head Start programs. And you could visually very rapidly see, and this is not exact data, but you can quickly visually see where these things fall. And you can imagine too having a needs map of where the most young children between birth to 5 are in each school district, and overlay that with an asset map that says this is where the services are, and you can quickly identify the gaps. So I've said a lot there.
Oh, that's great. As I'm looking at this, I guess as if I'm with a nonprofit, I have to say, okay, we have all of this. How does that help us move forward? Right?
Right. Right. So this in this particular case, we're speaking specifically to like coalitions, like these groups
Okay.
that are trying to. So you're trying to either advocate to the state for new policies, and you need to show where the gaps are within your region. For example,
Okay.
this would be an opportunity to do that. I'm going to show you an example of Mark with Allidaid Consulting, example that he did for the entire state of Rhode Island. So he, crafted this map that's showing all of those key players, Department of Environmental Management, Department of Health and Human Resources, and then a whole host of nonprofits. This was all in sort of the food justice environment, food resources environment. So
Food
you stab,
deserts and things like
you
that.
got it. It immediately would identify where your food deserts are. And then you can take that, once you've sort of coded this visually, you can then move into breaking it down by a particular, county and municipalities within it. And then here's your key of food pantries and SNAP providers and WIC providers, and immediately start to identify again where are the gaps, where are the services, and it's so much more accessible to broad audiences. So this kind of document is bringing elected officials back again and again to provide them sort of the analysis or to do additional analysis that they need, and it's providing tools for those nonprofits to say, here's where we're lacking and here's how we mobilize these very tangible tools through which to demonstrate and illustrate where need is and where services are and where they
It
are or
seems
not
to
meeting
me
that need.
it seems to me that this would be extremely helpful to foundations. And I say that because um, I've had conversations with community foundations, of which you're
Mhm.
very familiar with. And one particular community foundation, I won't mention the name, but they got over $150 million in a gift that was unrestricted.
Wow.
And of course, everybody wanted a piece of that in the county that they were in. But the president was smart enough to say, "Well, let's do an assessment of what our needs are." He took a year. He went out and held like 300 meetings and to find out what people felt the needs of the community were. And then he asked a really important question. He said, "How do we know how many food banks we have? How do we know how many, theaters we have? People coming to us from all over. And why aren't these people collaborating with each other? Why are they
Yeah.
duplicating services, right?" So it seems to me that a mapping like this, if you had that and you went to a funder, you could clearly show them what's going on in the community, who's doing what, at least in your niche, right? Whether it be, food deserts or food insecurity, whatever, or it might be the arts or whatever. But
Yeah.
you could show A, who's doing what, and B, where the gaps are. And that would be extremely helpful to a foundation, whether it's a community foundation or a funder or a private foundation, even a government funder.
That's exactly right. Funders are asking, or when there's opportunities for organizations, or the current, uncertain times we're in and the stressors that small nonprofits are in, they might realize right now we're in a time where we need to be talking to our potential collaborators and find those synergies. Sometimes they come back and say, we're not sure who else is in this environment. We don't know those organizations. What an opportunity for a community foundation, for example. Even if they just started with their own grantees, they don't have to identify every nonprofit in the area, although you can do that too. But you can say, here's our grantees, here's the buckets they fall within, and then you can code them by those that have a budget of under $100,000, and a different code for those that are between 100 and $500,000 or something. So you can quickly see, you can understand the size, the general services they're providing, and quickly identify those potential collaborators. And then you can dovetail that into building that self-awareness about collaboration into your grant cycles, and you've really started to transform the way a community collaborates.
Now, it seems to me that this kind of mapping too would encourage a funder to say, okay, there's a gap here, and to maybe do a request for proposal to
Mhm.
fill that gap. Has that happened in your experience? I mean, it seems to me it would be a great opportunity.
Yeah, I think that's what Mark is seeing in Rhode Island from those larger, more extensive maps, is seeing that kind of activity quickly mobilizing. And these are living maps too, right? They can't be static because of what you just said. You put this map out in front of people, people's behavior changes quite rapidly, and organizational behaviors start to change quite rapidly. And so being able to do, keep these documents as a living document to update that information provides, also helps you identify trends in the community, and certainly sector-wide health and trends within the sector.
Well, my experience with collaboration has had good results and bad results. So anything to help that process would be better for the funder. It would be better for the populations that the nonprofits serve. It would be a way for nonprofits to focus their resources on what they're really good at and let other nonprofits do what they're really good at. And it seems that the efficiency could be much higher. The funding would probably increase because funders would say, okay, this makes sense to me. And they wouldn't feel like they were investing things that they didn't quite know where they were going because you've already mapped out a lot of this stuff. So I think that's great. So where do we go from here then?
I mean, in terms of asset mapping, there's sort of a continuum. We start with sort of stakeholder mapping, like you're just trying to identify who the players are so everybody comes in the room and can get on the same page, right? Because these are complex systems, and we're trying to build new leaders. We just going through the great retirement, right? We need these young leaders to understand these systems that don't have the historical knowledge of the organizations and their services in the community. This is a great way to get them on the same page. Then you get into that mapping of like, okay, what services are being provided, and you can drill in very specifically using your theories of change and logic models, what have you, to figure out what you want to get at. And then
Now, I want to stop you just for a minute here. You just mentioned theory of change, and it's been in the back of my mind. People try to make this complicated, right? Theory of change. Oh, what's the theory of change? Well, can you give me your explanation? I know what my explanation of theory of change is, but can you give me your explanation of what theory of change is?
I think every nonprofit has to be asking themselves those questions, because you need to know the why of what you're doing, and you want to be looking at your activities, what the result of those activities you hope them to be, and what is your vision for where you'd like to be and where you'd like the community to be and those that you serve to be. And um, a theory of change, again, is a very living cycle, right? So,
Yeah, I was going to say it's a cycle. Yeah,
it's a
sure. Yeah.
cycle. And so this kind of touches on the theme we've been talking throughout. Like, how are you incorporating feedback loops into your work? How are you determining whether your theory of change actually is meaningful? A documentary a decade ago that, was getting at that real, we're doing domestic violence education classes for individuals who had been charged with domestic, what have you, and they were doing these theories of change, and what they learned is that domestic violence was going up as from the educational classes, as opposed to going down. And if they hadn't
Really?
been,
Wow.
yes, and that they learned that the approach that they were taking was not the right approach, right? It was stimulating some other behaviors. But then it got them into different methods. And then when they landed on the right one, they had been measuring, they had been evaluating the whole time. They knew things were different. We're aware of other, right? So there's some other national programs that have had some bad press because their approach has, over time, was recognized as not actually being meaningful and effective.
Yeah, and when I've taught theory of change, everybody's like, well, what is the theory of change? Well, whatever your theory is of how things change, and then you test that, and then you come back around in the cycle, and you come up with a more refined theory of change, or maybe a totally different theory of change, until you land on the theory of change that actually works. And it's called a theory because it hasn't been proven yet, right?
You got it.
Now, there are some evidence-based theories that have worked in other populations and other areas of the country. You can kind of start with that. Doesn't mean it's going to work where you are or with your population, but you've got to have a theory of change because to me, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, that's kind of your evaluation starting point, is it not?
Exactly. And that's where we'll often start with that when we're developing the prompts for ripple effects mapping session, or certainly if we're doing in these larger environments, this coalition asset mapping, that's what we're looking at. What's the theory of change? And occasionally you ask for that and they say, well, we don't really have one. And you're like, well, let's start with that.
Okay, then what are you doing? Yes, but I think
Yeah.
that people are not familiar with the term and they may have a theory of change. They don't realize that it's called that, right?
That's right. And it can intimidate people, and people feel like it's, there's so much to say for just doing good work out there, right? I mean, there's a lot of organizations just doing good work. But over time, depending on the life cycle of your organization, you're going to have to move from like just being passionate and doing good work to like sustaining it, to bringing in new leadership, to building a structure that's then trusted within within a community to be able to provide reliable services over time that actually have a positive impact and create a true systemic change, right? And so the life cycles of our organizations move us through that. So I get that some organizations can kind of reel at those conversations, and others are like, yeah, that's the meat of what we do, and those are the tools of movement. So that's the unique thing when you're in a community foundation environment. You're dealing with all those organizations, and you sort of have to have a real awareness of the life cycles of those organizations.
It's clear that collaboration with other nonprofits is important to increase our funding, as Janet Hansel has explained. And it's probably more important now than ever before. If you like what she said, then please like the video and let us know in the comments what other topics you would like us to cover in the future. The nonprofit sector is facing a very difficult time, not only with decreased funding, but with an increase in needs for our services. How can we weather these current and future storms? In part 4 of our interview with Janet, she offers her advice on how to survive and thrive in the face of adversity based on her many years of experience as a foundation professional and nonprofit consultant. Check out her advice right here.